Okay, everyone, let me go ahead and share my screen so that way we can finish off with chapter 10 here. Okay, so let me go ahead and minimize this and all that. Okay, so we're going to be finishing up here on civil liberties, and then we're going to move to civil rights here in a bit. So the last couple of civil liberties that we need to take a look at were Second Amendment right to bear arms, as well as abortion. So we're going to take a look at those two right now here. So when the book is talking about this concept of a right to keep and bear arms, obviously, of course, this stems from the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. And I think a lot of you all have probably heard of the Second Amendment um, because it's been in the news a lot over the last, I would say, over the last even couple of decades. It's even more so than years. So it's been a hotly contested political debate in the United States for many, many years. And a lot of this, of course, stems from the the unfortunate situation where we've had more of these mass shootings that have been happening. I mean, we had another one last week over at this other school. There's been so many of these that have been happening in schools, and so that is what fuels this debate about the concept of the Second Amendment, because it is something that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. So let's dive into why there are very strong opinions about this. So the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution reads: "The war-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." So there's a good video that I have in the resources from the History Channel, and it gives a historical summary of the Second Amendment in terms of its historical significance. Basically, it's talking about why do we have the Second Amendment in the first place, and the history of it is very interesting because it goes into the this was the Second Amendment came about during the debate and discussion about the role of government within the new United States, right? This was during the time of the ratification of the Constitution, where the Anti-Federalists were very concerned about this notion of the United States creating a standing army, a standing navy, right? Basically, a military that would be controlled by the federal government. Originally, the video talks about this. Originally, these states had a system where if if they needed to defend themselves against another country like Great Britain or France, what they would do is they would all the states had their own state militias, and then the idea was that the state militias would band together and unite against whatever foreign adversary that they needed to defend themselves against. So it was that extra step of they what it did was that it created an extra step where in order for the United States to have a military force that would be comprised of different people from across the country, they had to unite, right? So it wasn't the federal government basically having these troops at their disposal, but instead they needed for the states to combine their forces, right? To join forces to combine their resources, and so that combining was something that the Anti-Federalists felt was a better way um, to keep from the tyranny of having the United States basically, the federal government deciding for themselves what they would do with the standing army. So again, I'm sorry. I know I'm not the best today, but I'm trying my best to try to explain this here. So ultimately, of course, this was scrapped during the constitutional process. In fact, some of the Federalist Papers also discussed this important notion of needing a strong national defense by having a standing army led by the federal government. And they were trying to convince the Anti-Federalists that this was okay, that this was not going to be turned against them. Because you also have to keep in mind that the Anti-Federalists also felt that they had just, they had just gone through the oppression from the British forces, quartering of soldiers in their houses and all that stuff. So they did not want for to have to go through that again, this time from the United States federal government. So ultimately, the Second Amendment was put in here as a way to empower people to feel like they could have the ability to defend themselves, to defend their houses, defend their property against an overreaching government. The video also talks about how that the nature of America also contributed to this because of the abundance of firearms, which definitely makes a lot of sense because again, America was on the edge of the frontier. It wasn't established. There's a lot of wilderness in America at the time. So obviously, of course, a lot of people were going to need firearms for their own personal protection to protect against, wild animals, to also hunt for their food, to also protect themselves against, Native Americans if they were having conflicts, things like that. And then we also see that the proliferation of firearms in America also contributed to issues in the American South when it came to keeping slaves in check, right? So it made it easier for the slaveholders to keep the slaves from rebelling and uprising because of their access to firearms, right? So it was meant as a way to intimidate them. Anyway, so the reason why I want to mention that is because a lot of people talk about, you know, why do we have a Second Amendment? What is the purpose of it? So I wanted to give some historical context in terms of why we have the Second Amendment. So shifting gears now towards today, um, we see the Second Amendment definitely has a ton of influence in American politics today, mostly because of the influence of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, which is one of the most influential interest groups in America at this time. And they are very much pro Second Amendment. They do not believe in really any type of regulation of guns, firearms. And what we're talking about here is because the Second Amendment question, there's a lot of different avenues that you can look at this, right? A lot of people will bring up issues about the types of firearms that people have access to, such as, the long rifles, when it comes to shotguns, or also the semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15s. Um, there's debate about, should Americans have access to those types of firearms, or is that protected under the Second Amendment? So the NRA obviously would say that yes, that is protected under the Second Amendment, that there shouldn't be restrictions on the type of firearms nor on the number of firearms that people can have, right? Uh, there's no quota, there's no limit to the number of guns you can have in your house and things, right? And so we see that obviously, of course, in more recent years, as it says, two-thirds of Americans and 51% of Texans do favor stricter gun control. So it makes sense, of course, that in Texas you would see less support for this. And what we mean by gun control is by putting restrictions on the types of firearms, maybe the number of firearms, also having more accountability for gun owners, where they have to, whether it's engage in more training or creating a national registry of who owns guns, and having to, having, or maybe another idea that's been brought up is for people to have to purchase insurance in order um, to use guns and things like that. So there's been a lot of these different ideas that have been put forth um, and the reason why this debate, like I mentioned, is very contentious, is, like I said, is because of gun violence that's been going on, especially when it comes to certain locations and areas, such as in schools, but also in, just other public places where people aggregate, such as movie theaters, churches. Even churches have been subjected to these types of incidents. And there's been many of these in Texas. Not, obviously, of course, Uvalde is the one that gets the most attention, because because the fact it was an elementary school and a very, very tragic situation. Um, I think I mentioned to you all that my girlfriend, she went to elementary school in Uvalde, not at Robb Elementary, but at the other elementary. They have two there in Uvalde. And so, of course, obviously, when that happened, she was extremely traumatized by that because that was her community, rightfully so for her to feel that way. But again, there's been other ones like the Santa Fe High School shooting south of Houston, Sutherland Springs, near San Antonio. We also had the El Paso Walmart shooting, and then we also had the one in Allen, Texas, at the shopping mall. Uh, there's been many of these. I know I'm missing some of them, but there's just been so many of these just here in Texas. But with that being said, we also do need to take a look at legally what is the doctrine for the Second Amendment, and it came out of two cases here more recently: the McDonald v. Chicago as well as the District of Columbia versus Heller. These two cases uh, dealt with what is the right. Basically what they dealt with was they defined. Excuse me. The Supreme Court defined what does the Second Amendment mean to the everyday person. Because as you can see here, up here over here in the description, talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So a lot of people have pointed to this first section of Second Amendment to try to make the argument that, hey, this is an antiquated amendment. It only deals with colonial times where, because we don't have militias anymore. So, that's one argument that some people, take when it comes to the interpretation of the Second Amendment. That's why it's controversial, because it's not really it's not as clearly defined as like the Third Amendment, the one that comes up later. Like, no quartering of soldiers in our houses. That really does not require much interpretation. But this one is a little bit more vague because it does reference it does reference it does reference a historical time from a couple hundred years ago. So some people might be like, well, then that means that it's not relevant today. But the Supreme Court said that they disagreed with that assertion. They said that yes, it is relevant. And so the first time in history, the Supreme Court officially ruled that the Second Amendment protected the rights of individuals to own firearms. So basically, what this means here is that the um, the Supreme Court ruled that people can carry firearms for their own personal protection, and that that is a right that the Second Amendment affords them. That people want to be able to carry firearms and have them in their house so they can protect against intruders, they are more than welcome to do so. And that leads us to the Castle Doctrine, Texas Castle Doctrine, which is a law allowing Texans who have undergone 10 hours of training carry concealed handguns and affirming the right of a citizen to defend their home against intrusion. So this is also a little bit outdated because the Castle Doctrine still remains where if someone enters your house, you do have the right to defend yourself and also to defend your house against someone being there that shouldn't be there, that is not supposed to be there, right? Um, and of course, this is something that, people obviously, you know, and living in Texas, and another thing I also want to mention about Texas in terms of why there tends to be a very popular gun culture in Texas, right? I'm sure you all are familiar with this, right? You probably, if you drive anywhere through the state, you'll probably see that there's advertisements, for there's advertisements for, I'm sorry, like for gun shows, and they also have the shooting galleries that you'll see, where people will go. And I've actually gone to a couple of those myself, to go and practice with a couple of my friends, since I did study criminal justice, I do have a lot of friends in law enforcement, so they've invited me before to go and shoot with them. So of course, you definitely have to be very careful when it comes to this. And I've also gone through this training here, um, that that where the way the training works is it's an all day training where in the morning you go through classroom scenarios where they teach you like um, they show you what the firearm is, how to properly load it and the components of it, and they also give you some scenarios in terms of like what not to do. Like we saw this one video where um, this guy was afraid that someone was going to break into his house, but then he went outside the house and he shot at the guy from the outside, and then the cops came and they arrested him because the guy was running away from his house, so he was no longer a threat to him. So that no longer counts as Texas Castle Doctrine because now that immediate threat for yourself is over. And things like that and something like that. So and it turned out that the guy that the guy was well okay, so I'm trying to like I said, no, it's fine. Let's just kind of skip it because it's kind of a little bit hazy. It's been almost 10 years since I've been to that. So but I do remember that the video that they did show us, showed like what not to do in terms of that, but the idea is that if they enter your house and they're not supposed to be there, that you do have the right to protect yourself and things like that. But now what's changed here is that a couple years ago we had what was called Texas constitutional carry, and so now you don't necessarily need to go through this training. It's still encouraged, but you don't necessarily need to go through this training in order to carry firearms in Texas. Now, there are, of course, restrictions still in terms of where you cannot carry firearms. Like, of course, you can't take them to like one of the restrictions is you cannot take them to um, to a courthouse because obviously, of course, that is a security threat. Um, so that's why if any of you have gone through the courthouse, you have to go through the metal detector and they search you and all that stuff. So there are restrictions in terms of where you cannot take the firearms here. And then in 2015, Texas allowed students and professors to carry weapons on campus despite objections from professors. So I actually remember one of my criminal justice professors at UTRGV was actually very vocal about this, saying that he was going to put it in his syllabus that he was not going to allow firearms. And I was like, well, syllabus versus the state constitution. I mean, what's going to win out here? You know what I mean? So it's just, and I'm sure he knew that, but he was, trying to make a statement, about, how he perceived the situation and all that. So, but last thing I also want to mention was that another reason why, like I said, that Texas tends to have a very popular gun culture is also for historical reasons, right? Because remember how I mentioned that the necessity for guns during the 13 colonies time also was seen in Texas, right? Because Texas also was a frontier state, and so they also had to deal with um, raids by the Native Americans, and of course, we had the Texas Revolution, right? And so, the famous, where the cannon they were trying to take the cannon back, and you've probably seen that famous flag, the come and take it one, which has been used for other things, where they've turned it into a meme or things like that. Like I know a couple years ago when they made that flag, they put like an AC because like people were upset that like ERCOT was trying to tell people to not use as much air conditioning. So somebody made a come and take it with the air conditioning. So I thought that was pretty funny. But okay, anyway. And like I said, guys, I know that today, like I said, I'm not quite. I'm a little bit out of it. So if this doesn't make sense, definitely please let me know, and I'll definitely do my best to explain it a little bit better here. But hopefully this makes sense in terms of why the Second Amendment, what it is, and some of the controversies with it, and we'll see what happens. If there are any changes later on at the national level, because in Texas, obviously, like I said, Texas is a very gun friendly state. We'll see if anything happens at the national level that might change some of these things. But for now, in Texas, um, there's pretty much a lot of freedom when it comes to carrying firearms in Texas. Okay, so now let's move on to abortion. The kind of an opposite issue, right? So even though the Second Amendment is all, as we mentioned, the Second Amendment is very controversial because of the nature of firearms and how they can be dangerous and the harm that they've been used, the harm that has happened through the improper use of firearms. Um, we also see the abortion issue is also controversial. And usually it's for some of the same reasons that because of the nature and the severity of the action itself. So now again, like I said, I've been studying this issue for many, many years, and I've come to the conclusion that one of the main reasons why this is a very difficult topic to really have any kind of compromise or anything like that is because the different sides on this issue, they can't even agree on basic ground rules for to engage with each other. Because let's break this down a bit. So obviously, of course, abortion is the early termination of a pregnancy. Um, and so what happens here is that obviously, of course, this is a difficult decision that's made by people. This is not something that is this is not something that people should take lightly. And so it becomes controversial because of the severity of the action, right? It becomes, because for some people, they believe that, terminating a pregnancy is wrong. They believe that they've even gone to say they've gone to say it's murder. Like you've heard this from the strong Christian right movements because in fact the religious right, which is it's this movement that started in the 1970s in response to Roe versus Wade. Um, they responded to this case by deciding that they needed to engage in the political process. So this is where you started to see the rise of, some of these televangelists like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. He passed away last year. Um, they started, organizations like the Moral Majority, and they also started, um, some of these organizations where they were starting to get involved in politics, right? Whether trying to run directly. Pat Robertson ran for president a couple years ago, back in the 1980s. Obviously, didn't get too much support, but he did launch a presidential campaign. And so we've seen the influence of the Christian right um, in other candidates like Donald Trump. Like they're very much in favor of him because of this, because of the stances on abortion, things like that. So abortion is very important to this group. And so because Texas is a very conservative state, and a lot of that conservatism is because of the religious groups that advocate against abortion. This has also influenced Texas leaders here. Okay, but let me kind of backtrack here because I did this a little bit out of order. So Roe versus Wade was a case that came out of Dallas where the issue of, you know, do women have the right to terminate their pregnancies? And originally they did not. And of course, also keep in mind that this is during the early 1970s. This is during um, the progressive movements that came about from the unpopularness of the Vietnam War, and this so a lot of these movements were really taking off based on these more progressive ideas. So ultimately, the Supreme Court did rule that the Constitution protected sexual privacy. That basically what the Supreme Court said in Roe versus Wade was that a woman's right to choose is legal because that is a personal matter, and that is a decision that should be made between the woman and her doctor, primary care physician. That it's not the government's role um, to be deciding what people are going to do with, with a medical decision that affects only them. Now, the problem with that though is that, yeah, a lot of people don't see it that way. A lot of people don't believe that it should solely be at the discretion of the female, right? They believe that the baby, right, that the baby also should have a right to be able to decide whether they want to, whether they want to whether they want to live or not, right? So again, it's a very controversial issue, right? So I think you all can see that this is something that you see why it's controversial, right? Because there's a lot of different interpretations. The action itself is very serious. You know, the premature ending of a pregnancy is very it is something that people don't carry lightly. And so as we showed here, in Texas, they do tend to be more on the pro life side. And of course, obviously, the Dobbs Mississippi case is not mentioned here because this again the textbook came out before it. But basically, I'm sure you all are recall that 2 years ago in that Dobbs case, Roe versus Wade was overturned. So now Roe versus Wade is no longer law here. It has been overturned. There have, of course, been pushback from states and pushback, where it's been a little bit hard to enforce, across the country, where some states are definitely ready to enforce this and other ones aren't. In a way, it's kind of similar to Brown versus Board of Education, where, as we're going to talk about here in a bit, not all the states completely complied. So we're kind of seeing this kind of play out. Um, because this country is extremely divided on a lot of issues, including this one. Of course, also the parental notification law is also mentioned that basically in Texas, if you have a woman who's underage and she wants to terminate her pregnancy, that she would have to get permission from her parents and all that. So, and that does become an issue because of the conservative nature of the state. That maybe these teenagers might not feel comfortable being able to talk to their parents about these types of things because the parents might not uh, look. And again, I'm not trying to give too much anecdotal information, but I mean, but I guess I can also share that I did grow up in a rather conservative household. Um, subjects like that weren't really those were off limit subjects when I was, when I was growing up in terms of, you know, talking about human sexuality and all that stuff. Those are things that I was just, and I think that it's something that's common, right? That a lot of parents struggle to be able to speak to their kids about those things and whether it's age appropriate or not. So that is definitely understandable. Um, but at the same time, those are subjects like I guess my argument is that you can't just like pretend it's not there, right? You can't just ignore it. You can't just like it's something that does have to be addressed at some time. And there's, people have different parents, are different in terms of when they feel comfortable or but sometimes they might not ever feel comfortable with and so I guess that's just the argument I guess I'm making is that it's something that I would definitely encourage for, I guess just, for parents to be able to have open communication with their children and be able to talk to them about anything, right? And I know like I don't have kids, but hopefully one day if I do, I definitely want, for them to feel like they can talk to me about anything and not feel like that I'm going to like if it's something obviously of course that they've done wrong, obviously of course we're going to address it, but we're going to do so in a mature and understanding manner. And I guess that's kind of why these parental notification laws, can be they can be also controversial because maybe um, these teenagers might not feel comfortable being able to share very personal information like that with their parents, which is important because if um, if there's a pregnancy going on, that's something that does need to be addressed. They might not feel comfortable doing so. So that's just kind of the nature of this type of political culture here within Texas. So yeah. Okay, so let's get to civil rights here really quickly. So the definition here of civil rights refers to actions the government must take in order to ensure equal citizenship for everyone. So uh, when we're looking at this concept of civil rights, basically what it means is that people in American society should have this expectation that it doesn't matter what their skin color is, it doesn't matter what their age is, gender, socioeconomic status, all of that is irrelevant to the way laws should operate in Texas, right? That people should be treated equally in the eyes of the law, right? That's what the 14th Amendment, we talked about that last time. So we're going to have several cases here that deal with specific civil rights issues. So first off, we're going to start with education. And then, of course, we're also going to talk about the continuing with education with the Edgewood v. Kirby case. But let's take a look at Robert's Board of Education first. But again, keep in mind that the concept of civil rights is this notion that you can't be discriminating against certain groups of people just because of the differences that they have. So anyway, with that being said, let's talk about Brown v. Board of Education here. So obviously, of course, one of the most famous Supreme Court decisions of all time, if not the most famous. Um, if you've taken Governor 2305, you'll definitely be familiar with it. But again, we can kind of we can kind of summarize it here in a bit. So what happened in Brown v. Board of Education was the controversy where this was stemming from Topeka, Kansas, where um, when Ms. Brown was trying to go to school to a closer school to where she was living, but unfortunately, she was not able to go to that school because that school was a whites only school. So she brought that case up through the courts. It ultimately got to the Supreme Court. And keep in mind that at the time, the Supreme Court had previously ruled that the concept of separate but equal was okay. This came from Plessy versus Ferguson. This was the case where Mr. Plessy was trying to. This was on a train in Louisiana, and Mr. Plessy was trying to sit in a whites only car box here, and he was denied that. And he was making the argument that no, I should be able to sit here because, and he made the correct argument. Sadly, it wasn't deemed that at the time, but history proved that Mr. Plessy was right because he was making the argument that hey, like, what should it matter if I'm African American? Like, I should be able to sit there too. I mean, why are we creating a second class citizenship for us? So again, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was okay as long as the accommodations were equal. Now, of course, we also know that that was not happening, right? The accommodations were not equal. But even if they were equal, that was irrelevant to Brown Board of Education because the Supreme Court ruled in a 9-0 decision that separating races is inherently unequal. That they were making a sociological argument that no, you cannot do that. Even if you had everything equal in terms of like having classrooms that were funded equally and you had all the same type of textbooks, even though as I mentioned before, that was not going on even to begin with. Uh, there were accounts of the colored schools always getting like the older textbooks, the outdated ones. They would get, the older equipment. So they weren't even abiding by separate but equal anyway. But even if they were, like I said, that still wouldn't be good enough because, like I said, the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot be separating races, that is not, that inherently is unequal. So ultimately, the segregation of schools is undone here in 1954. Now, it does take a while for this to trickle down throughout the rest of the country, especially in southern states like Texas. Texas school districts fought desegregation. They fought it for a good almost 20 years after Brown's Board of Education. It wasn't until the early 1970s when all the schools in Texas were ultimately integrated. And the reason why they were integrated was because the federal government was going to cut off funds to these schools if they did not adhere to Brown's Board of Education. Also, keep in mind that at the time, we not only had Brown's Board of Education now in the 1970s, but we also had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s during the Johnson administration. Lyndon Johnson, former president, also native Texan here. So, and also a former Texas educator. He used to teach school children in Cotula, in between Laredo and San Antonio. So, anyway, but with that being said, we see here though that there is also still this legacy of segregation where we still see it throughout everyday lifestyle. This often includes racial segregation in housing patterns. This is the redlining situation where um, white homeowners would be hesitant to sell their houses to minorities because they felt that that would decrease the value of their property. And then banks also were hesitant to make mortgage loans to lower income families, even if their income was fine. There was still that discrimination there, and economic segregation because of the different costs for housing in different neighborhoods, right? So we still see this to this day where, some parts of, especially like in bigger cities, right, you can see that some of the parts of the cities, especially like in the inner city parts, they tend to uh, they tend to be a little bit more. How do I say it? Like since they tend to now, of course, also keep in mind that this was before the gentrification process, which we're also going to talk about right now. But a lot of these inner cities in these larger cities, this used to be, they didn't have as much money coming in, so they weren't as well kept, and a lot of these inner cities, most of the people that lived in them were minorities, unfortunately. Now, what we're also seeing, like I said, in more recent years, we're also seeing a process called gentrification. I think some of y'all are familiar with this process too, right? This is a process um, where developers are going into these inner city areas and they are fixing them up, but this comes at a price, right? Because now this attracts new businesses, and this is going to drive up the cost of living because now how home values are higher, property tax values are higher. And so this creates a situation where the longtime residents end up getting priced out of their communities, right? Which again, that's a whole nother topic we'll talk about later on in the class, because that definitely is something that I think some of us have some opinions about. And then the creation of charter and private schools, which we've also seen um, more of this proliferation is, and this is one of the major political fights that's going on right now in Texas politics right now. Governor Abbott recently has been advocating for school vouchers, where this is something that he is trying to advocate for, where he wants for the legislature to pass school voucher programs where families will be able to um, they'll be able to have access to money that they can then shop around for where they want to send their kids at. Now, of course, there are um, there's pros and cons to this issue, which later on in the class we will talk more about that. But in terms of how it rose about from segregation was you had the creation of charter and private schools. Some of these schools started as a means to kind of skirt around this idea of segregation. Either they would be selective with who they would admit because they're a private school, so they can have those admissions process, or they would also form as a result for white students to leave the public schools because of the integration and then go onto these private schools. And of course, we also have the influence of COVID as of more recently. This is especially true during the early days of the pandemic, where when everything went online, and some school districts did not have the funds or the means to be able to facilitate online learning. I mean, that was a difficult situation because everyone was just kind of unprepared in the K through 12 setting. In the colleges, we were a little bit more prepared because we teach online as well, so we already have that setup. But in K through 12, that was something that was just kind of, yeah. I remember when it first happened, that was definitely a nightmare for K through 12 people because they had to shuffle everything online when everything shut down in the after spring break 2020. So anyway, let's go and continue here. So let's talk about Edgewood v. Kirby, which is another important state case. This was coming out of the San Antonio area. So what was happening in Texas was that you had a wide disparity between very affluent school districts that resided in the suburbs, like especially like in the Dallas area. Like some of those school districts up there are just flush with cash. Same thing like in the Austin area, because obviously, of course, they have a lot of wealthy people that live in those neighborhoods. And so the schools are able to, to get a lot of money because of who lives there. Now, before Edgewood v. Kirby, the problem was that the opposite also was true, that school districts in very poor areas weren't getting any money. Because again, in Texas, school funding is primarily funded through property taxes. So that's why more affluent areas are going to have access to more money. But the issue, and that's not necessarily the issue, was not necessarily that the richer school districts had more money. The issue was that poorer districts did not have enough money to be able to adequately educate students. You had a situation where in Texas that depending on where you lived, that could determine whether you had a better education or not. Because if you lived in a poorer district, then you wouldn't have access to new computers or you know other renovations for the buildings, things like that. So the buildings would be a little bit more run down. Um, right. So Edgewood v. Kirby ruled that the state system of financing its public schools violated the state constitution and laws. So ultimately, we had, and the issue again was equal of opportunity versus equality of result here, right? So they were trying, they were able to determine that the disparity between, like I said, these richer school districts and these poorer school districts was very was very wide, and you did have a huge disparity. So ultimately, we had the Robin Hood law that was introduced, where um, richer school districts would send money to poor districts. So this was kind of like you could consider this an example of wealth redistribution, where they were redistribute the more wealthier districts were sending money over to the poor districts. Now, this was declared unconstitutional in 2005, but there have been tweaks to it since then, where a lot of this revenue sharing is still happening. There's a good video that I have uh, from Austin, from one of the. There's a good video that I have in the resources from one of the news media outlets in Austin, and they actually do get Governor Abbott to they do an interview with him, and he talks about um, his criticisms of this Robin Hood situation, and yeah, and it is controversial because in the video it talks about how there was this Austin ISD that was sending over half of of the property tax collection money, sending it to other districts across the state. Now, so again, I definitely see that I could definitely see why people would have an issue with that. Let's say, you have like a $500,000 home or something like that, and you're paying I don't know, let's say like $10,000 in property taxes a year, and then half of that isn't even going to the local community, right? Like you just paid 5,000 to send money to students in another part of the state. So I'm not saying that everybody disagrees with that, right? Some people are fine with that, but I'm sure you could also see why some people might not like that, right? Some people might not want for their tax money going to somewhere outside of their community. Because property taxes are considered local, but when it comes to education, some of that money does get sent off to other places. So that's why some people are not really like that. And of course, again, continuing with the COVID challenges for education, um, we will see how this plays out in terms of like it's we'll see in terms of because there has been some reporting on that test scores have not been as good since the pandemic started, and so we'll see how this plays out. But it definitely is something that um, we do need to keep an eye on because um, education is extremely important, and we definitely need to try to do our best, to be able to educate our students. And so hopefully we'll see. Um, we'll see how this plays out, but we are still feeling the effects of that in terms of student attainment and um, standardized testing and all that stuff. We are seeing a dip in that still because of what's been happening with COVID and all that. So okay, let's talk about some more sad civil rights issues. Very tragic situations here. The Jasper, Texas situation. So Jasper, Texas is in East Texas. It's close to the border with Louisiana. And in 1998, you had the tragic murder of Mr. James Byrd. He was some white supremacists. They tied him to the back of their truck. They dragged him for miles, and they just um, his body was just in pieces, unfortunately, because of just what they did to this guy who was just was only murdered because of the color of his skin. Just very, very disgusting in terms of what these people did to him. Three of them were charged, two of them were sentenced to death. So this is, one of the most gruesome, not the most gruesome, hate crime uh, in Texas history. Texas has had, unfortunately, a history of these types of incidences. Texas did have several lynchings during the, you know, during the Jim Crow era time frame. One of the most infamous ones was the Jesse Washington lynching in Waco, Texas. That one was also, that was a tough one also. So there's been several of these unfortunate incidents, but what's horrifying about what happened with Mr. James Byrd was that this happened in modern times, right? Like we thought that we had moved past these types of things, but unfortunately, racism is still something that is still being dealt with, and I am a little bit familiar with the East Texas area, not in Jasper, but like I shared with y'all that I used to have an ex-girlfriend that lived in Nacogdoches, which is pretty close to Jasper. So I'm familiar with that area. It's a very beautiful area within the Piney Woods, very, very gorgeous. But unfortunately, you do see that there is still some of the semblance of racism and some of these sundown towns. Like you probably heard what a sundown town is where minorities are not welcome after sunset, where they got to get out of their that city. Vidor, Texas, which is near Beaumont, Port Arthur, they've had a very bad reputation of being considered one of these sundown towns. So you still see a lot of the, this this unfortunate these situations, in some parts of the state, and it is very difficult. Shifting gears now to another part of the state, Tulia. This is in the Panhandle. Last summer, not this past one, but in the summer 2023, I actually had a chance to drive past Tulia. It's in between Lubbock and Amarillo because I was in the area looking for a trailer, and then I ended up going to the Baladuran state park there. But anyway, I just wanted to share that that I've been through the area, so it's over in the Panhandle. So what happened with this one? And there's a good 60 minutes. Both there's a BBC video that discusses the Jasper, Texas murder, and then there's also a good 60 minutes video that discusses what happened in Tulia. So what happened in Tulia was they hired this undercover cop, and he was responsible for having 46 people arrested and convicted on drug charges. It was a big roundup. If you watch the 60 minutes video, you'll see that um, he didn't have any type of consequential evidence. It was basically all his word, right? It was basically his testimony, but he didn't have any corroborating testimony. He didn't have any type of pictures or any type of video, any type of audio. It was just, his word versus the accused here. So ultimately, of course, the people that were arrested in Tulia were pardoned, and what also keep in mind is that almost all the people who were arrested were black. So obviously, of course, you could see there was allegations of it being racially motivated, and ultimately, uh, the judge, there was a Texas judge that ultimately pardoned and released all of the arrestees because of the lack of evidence from Tom Coleman. That's the name of the deputy that was working for the Tulia Police Department. So that's why that's controversial because of the nature of the incident here and who they targeted. Other issues, relationship between black citizens and police. Of course, the we had the Dallas shooting in the downtown area, where um, several Dart is the organization there in the Dallas downtown area for the police. Um, they unfortunately were targeted and killed in this situation. Um, where this guy was just going and shooting at police officers there in that downtown shooting. So I remember I was watching that when it happened. It was uh, very chilling to see, especially because I do have a couple of friends who are in law enforcement in the Dallas area. So thankfully they were okay. But yeah, and of course, and this would not be the last incident that we'd have in Dallas. Obviously, of course, we had the Black Lives Matter movement it started in August 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, because of the Michael Brown situation, and since then we've had other incidences, similar incidences, like I mentioned to you all before, that the underlying issue with Black Lives Matter is the lethal use of force used by police officers um, against minorities, and those whether that lethal use of force was justified, and whether the fact that the suspects were minorities, if that had something to do with the if that had something to do with how quickly the use of force was used or the decision to use the lethal use of force, right? That basically what I'm trying to say is that did that person's skin color, did that have any impact in terms of um, the decision to use lethal use of force? Of course, we also had the Botham John and Amber Geiger situation. This, of course, was also took place in Dallas, where Amber Geiger, who was a former police officer there, mistakenly went into Botham's apartment because she thought it was hers, and she fired and killed him. Unfortunately, so yeah, that was another unfortunate situation, of course, and also more recently the and we've had several of these other incidences, right? Like the Breonna Taylor situation in Kentucky. She was a paramedic, and she also was killed, by gunfire that was happening there, and of course, also the George Floyd incident, which also has ties to Texas because I mentioned he's originally from the Houston area and he went to school at Kingsville. So, um, yeah, just there's been a lot of these unfortunate incidences in the last couple of years, and we've seen that it is something that definitely does require attention and does require discussions on this. Um, but regardless, but it's still very tragic regardless of that. Studies reveal that disparities do exist in minority treatment by police officers. So that's a whole nother topic. I could be here all day talking about, police subculture and some of the issues that we see in American policing today and all that. And so it's a complex situation. Again, I've studied some of this. I mean, I'm not gonna claim that I'm an expert on this. No, absolutely not. Even though I'm gonna be working on a PhD in criminal justice, um, but it is something that if we're just thinking logically here, that pretty much any profession, anybody who is a professional can always look to improve on their craft. I mean, even me, right? I always try every year to try to improve how I do my job. And so I guess what I would like to see is I just want, for for these agencies to definitely be receptive to being more introspective when it comes to looking at their policies and looking to see how they can improve and how they can better serve the community. Because I think sometimes what happens with police subculture is there might be too much of an us versus them mentality. There might be too much of this, so I'm not a big fan of like militarization of police because I they are not the same thing. They don't have the same objectives. And so I also have issues when it comes to like the types of recruitment that goes on where, some police departments they tend to favor more people with physical traits as opposed to maybe more emotional intelligence. Because at the end of the day, I mean, you could just kind of put it this way, like, so if you're looking at like a police officer, like in terms of like what do they normally do in everyday situations, are they going to talk to people more or are they going to have to jump a fence more? I mean, yeah, they might have to jump a fence. That definitely does happen if they have to engage in a pursuit, but they're not jumping fences all day every day. Are they talking to people all day every day? Yes, they are. So I would definitely want to see more of this, more of a more attention be devoted to these types of this type of training and this type of mindset to where we're looking for people who are going to be able to speak to the public, be able to provide service. Yes, obviously, of course, to respond to emergencies and to do what needs to be done to maintain law and order. Of course, obviously that is essential, but to also do so in a way that is that tries to de-escalate and tries to be respectful of the public and the community that they serve. So that's why I'm definitely in favor of like civilian boards that review police complaints, and things like that, and just just to have more transparency. And I would say that for any agency. I mean, because it's not just police agencies that have issues with transparency. It's a lot of public agencies and public public servants. That's why I said before, like, I don't understand why public servants why they get all offended when people like are, you know, like we serve the public, we need to be there for the public, within reason, of course. Okay, last couple of things that we'll talk about here. Okay, so we got a couple more, so maybe we can kind of finish this off here in the next couple of minutes here. Okay, so civil rights for convicted criminals. So this is another one that also gets a lot of negative attention here, and so I'll also give my thoughts here since I'm a former correctional officer. Let me also give my thoughts here. Even when incarcerated, prisoners retain some civil rights. We have a constitution. We have a Bill of Rights that a lot of our Bill of Rights, a lot of those 10 Bill of Rights deal with criminal procedure. Um, a lot of them deal with criminal procedure throughout the entire legal process. When it comes to convicted prisoners, we do have the Eighth Amendment, which discusses the concept of cruel and unusual punishment. Okay. Now, there is a lot of disagreement, though, on what actually counts as cruel and unusual punishment. Um, let's take a look at the Reese v. Estelle case, 1972. So this was a case in which the it's called TDCJ now, but the old Texas Department of Corrections, basically the state agency that's involved with the prisons. Uh, because what prison is, just to clarify, because some people might not be aware of this, jail and prison are not the same. When you're in jail, it's usually because you have been arrested and you're awaiting trial if you can't pay bail. Once you get convicted, then you go to prison and you serve out your sentence. So in the prisons, what was happening was that there were issues of there were issues with how inmates were being treated in the prisons. They were being treated very harshly. Physical security was lacking. This meant that inmates were fearful for they were being beat up by fellow inmates, especially ones that were in rival gangs. Or another situation is where inmates felt like they had to join gangs because if they didn't, then they weren't going to have that protection. So it was kind of like an arms race when it came to gangs, right? That everyone was just joining all these gangs because they felt powerless because the security staff were not able to adequately protect inmates and all that. And also keep in mind that a lot of this is also not really the inmates' fault. It's because of the way the prisons are set up, which I'll explain right now. So the living and working conditions were also very poor, where you had overcrowding prisons. This is a big issue. where you have way too many prisoners and not enough space for them. This is where like you have like because again, I've worked in these prisons before. You have these big pods, they call them pods, where you've got this humongous room, and you've got all these inmates there in one big room, and they've got their bunks and all that stuff. And that's just a recipe for disaster because you're expecting for a bunch of like criminals to all be congregated together. That makes no sense at all. Now, granted, the reason why it happens is because they just don't have the funding, to be able to adequately maintain these people. And there's not really a lot of support to increase funding because a lot of people feel that why should we be spending money on inmates, especially when it comes to medical care, right? That not a lot of people are in favor of providing medical care for them because, well, they're criminals, right? They feel like a lot of the general public tends to feel like deserve they don't deserve as many rights or things. But yeah, but medical care, especially for medical emergencies, was lacking, such as not responding to really immediate health concerns, like if it's a medical emergency, taking too much time to respond. Internal punishment, you know, unfortunately, there was reports of beatings, from correctional staff, to inmates. This has been something that's been a problem in Texas prisons, and access to courts of law for inmates. So they were also making the argument in Ruiz Viestel that the prisons were not allowing for the inmates to have adequate access to their attorneys or adequate access to law libraries to be able to go and research their cases, right? So federal judge put Texas prisons under federal supervision until 2002, where they had to where they had to make these adequate changes. One of the more recent controversies that I've seen several news reports on in the last couple of years in Texas has been the issue of should prisons have air conditioning? Now, I've got some opinions on this because I'm a former correctional officer, so I feel like my I feel like my insight into this topic definitely, I feel like I can comment on this probably more so than the average person because I've actually worked in one of these places. Um, Now in Texas, of course, obviously we have very extreme temperatures, right? Especially in the summer. Like I said, I've worked in these places before, and it can get just downright unbearable. You can't even breathe in there because of the lack of air circulation. And I always hear comments by people, "Oh, well, it's prison; it's not supposed to be fun." And here's what I always respond to those people. I always respond to them, okay, so what about the correctional officers? Do they have is it okay that they get subjected to that? And every time I say that, it's always crickets. No one ever has a response to that because it's true. Like the correctional officers do not have to, they have a job, a tough enough job as it is. So we're going to make their job even more dangerous. And that's also not taking into account, as more recently when it talks about COVID here, that air conditioning and air circulation is not a luxury. It is a necessity because of the fact that there are toxins in the air. We breathe the air, we share the air. So air has to be constantly circulating out so that it can be as safe and clean as possible. And so the COVID pandemic has brought about a lot of issues that we hadn't really looked at before. And we also see here that that when COVID first started, the prisons were probably the most dangerous place because, like I mentioned, it's overcrowded. They could not social distance over there. They could not stay 6 feet apart. There's some where they're all kind of like they're locked into like one cell and they're all in there next to each other. So it just was impossible for. So of course the virus was going to proliferate in that type of setting and things like that, right? So again, I do understand why people wouldn't want to provide more accommodations for prisoners because yeah, I mean they're not obviously of course if they've done really horrible stuff, they're that's not good, right? But at the same time, we do have to provide basic protections. And the courts have said that Texas has lacked in that, so it's still a controversy that we're still seeing. Okay, capital punishment really quickly, and then okay, so I think we just have two. Yeah, we have two more slides, and then we'll finish here really quickly. So capital punishment. So um, Texas leads the nation in executions. The executions happen in Huntsville, which is the headquarters of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. So they have their death row unit there in Huntsville. Now, the death penalty itself is also somewhat controversial because there, of course, are competing viewpoints when it comes to um, whether we should have the death penalty or not. As I've said before, back in the 1970s, there was a movement to try to call for the death penalty to be considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. But as I mentioned before, that the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty itself is not cruel and unusual, but the methods that are used for it can be. That's why we try to have more humane type of executions. We don't hang people anymore, right? We do the lethal injection where they try to make it as painless as possible, even though there are issues with that. Um, but in Texas, of course, like we see, like we see that the death penalty is popular in Texas. Majority of Texans do support it, although rates of support are decreasing, so it's not as popular as it used to be. The state continues to debate some of these other issues, like age of convicts at the time of the crime. So again, so I used to work there at the juvenile center there, the uh, Texas Juvenile Justice Department. So we dealt with these younger offenders who had committed very heinous crimes. I worked with offenders that had murdered people. So so I've seen the worst of the worst when it comes to some of these groups of kids. Like it very very dangerous. I was assaulted several times there, unfortunately. I mean, I'm okay, uh, but I was assaulted there both verbally and physically. And so yeah, it's definitely a very dangerous job, and I'm glad I'm not there anymore. Um, but yeah, the age of convicts at the time of the crime is important because we have to, because so and the courts haven't had they've got a difficult job with this because if let's say you've got a 16-year-old that murdered someone, is 16, is that an age where they can be held accountable? What I mean by that is, would you hold them accountable at the same level if it was someone, you know, who was a little bit older, had done that crime, had committed that crime? Or is 16, are they still maybe not quite completely aware of the magnitude of the bad decision that they've made? Now, again, I'm not trying to take sides, and I'm not trying to say whether I would agree or disagree with that. Like a 16-year-old being tried as an adult. What I'm trying to say here is that it is difficult, right? Because of the nature of the crime, right? If it's just, if it's some 16-year-old robbing something from HEB, that's no big deal, right? I mean, it's bad, but it's not going to carry the same weight as a 16-year-old that goes and murders someone, right? Obviously, of course, that's going to carry a lot more. Uh, that's definitely a much more difficult decision. And that is a difficult decision in terms of what do we do with someone who's almost an adult, but just did something that if they were a year or two older, you know, they might, they might be going to life in prison or things like that, right? So it's definitely a tough one. Um, Life without parole, of course, and of course, also keep in mind that the Supreme Court also ruled because Texas did used to um, execute minors, but the Supreme Court ruled that no, that's not allowed here, right? As we've progressed, uh, as we've gotten a little bit more enlightened when it comes to the law and things like that. Life without parole has been considered an alternative to the death penalty because people also make the argument that that death row can be rather expensive because when someone is convicted and then they are sentenced to be executed, it usually takes them about 20 years for them to ultimately be executed. And the reason for that is because the state tries to do their best to dot their I's and cross their T's when it comes to ensuring that everything was done on the up and up, that the evidence was collected legally, that there weren't any issues with the evidence. But unfortunately, we have seen that the possibility of executing the innocent has happened, right? Because we have heard of cases where um, people on death row were exonerated, where there was issues with like DNA evidence or something like that. So if there have been exonerations on death row, that also tells you, well, maybe there were other people that were executed, maybe where they did commit this crime. So it's definitely a chilling thing to think about if an innocent person was executed for a crime they didn't commit, unfortunately. So that's why the argument is, well, the threat of that, the threat of executing someone who's innocent is too great of a risk to have executions in the first place. That's the argument that the anti-death penalty people are making. The mental fitness of the accused is also important, right? That, and we do have some legal terminology for this, where if let's say someone comes home and they see their partner is cheating on them, and then the partner coming home goes and kills the person that their partner was cheating with, that's considered what's called a crime of passion, right? So that obviously, of course, that's bad, and no one is excusing that, but that's not quite the same as, let's say, someone going and stalking someone, finding all their information and then going, to their house and murdering them, right? Because that was premeditated, right? That took a lot more effort, a lot more thought went into it. So you could make an argument that they knew what they were doing more so than someone who just came home, lost it, and you could understand why someone would be upset about that, right? If but someone you loved and you found out they were cheating on you, that's very, very painful. So, not to say that, obviously, of course, you still need to not go and do something that extreme. But what I'm saying is that the courts do take that into consideration, and they, the sentence won't be as harsh as opposed to someone who goes and premeditately murders someone, type of thing. So you also have to look at that as well. Um, the mental fitness, or also, you know, does this person have severe psychological problems? Now, you could also make a counter argument. Well, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because no rational person would go and murder someone, right? That if you murder someone, that there has to be something mentally wrong with you, right? I mean, I think that could be pretty straightforward here. But what they're looking at is, did they know exactly what they were doing in that moment? They try to, the insanity, I guess, argument, right, type of thing, right? And in Texas, it's very hard to get to get an insanity plea. And if you do, then they're going to sentence you to, like, life in like a mental institution or something like that. So you're still not ever going to be able to go home, but at least you won't be executed. So, but it is very hard to get that standard met. And then of course the handling of the appeals, like we mentioned, that's why death row takes a long time, because the appeal process is very lengthy. Every death row inmate, once they get sentenced to death, their case has to automatically be appealed. Again, just to make sure that everything is done correctly. But sometimes, as um, the appeals might not, if there's issues with the evidence, and like I mentioned also, if keep in mind that a lot of these people who are on death row probably do not have the best attorneys. They probably don't have their own attorney, because you can make an argument that, hey, if they were doing better financially, they probably wouldn't have had the mental issues to then go and murder someone, right? So there's an argument to be made that if a person's well off financially, they're probably not going to there's going to be less of a risk for them to go and commit some harsh crimes. There is some links between, lower economic status levels and some of these more heinous crimes and things like that. Okay, last one here. Let's talk about tort reform, and then we'll end for today. Last thing here. So sorry that we're going to go a little bit over. Let's go to finish it here. Um, so a tort is a private or civil wrong or injury resulting from a breach of a legal duty that exists by reason of society's expectations and appropriate behavior rather than a contract, right? So a tort is basically where you go and so a good example with this would be like for surgery. So you see torts a lot in the medical field, because when you're going to go get surgery done, the expectation is that they're going to fix the issue, right? The expectation is that you're going to be better off than what you were when you went in, because then why have the surgery? However, though, if, let's say, there's a botch of the surgery, right? Let's say this, the surgeon, which does happen sometimes, right? Let's say they make a mistake or something like that, right? And then you end up getting some complications because of the surgery. So that's why, for me personally, like, I got this from my mom. Like, she's the same as you. Like, she looked at surgery as being like a last resort, to where, do not get surgery unless you absolutely need to. Um, so I've had surgery one time on my right knee. I tore my meniscus, and I mean, it's okay, but it's never gonna be it's never gonna be the same, unfortunately. But if that's the worst thing that I've gone through, then I'm okay. People have gone through way worse than that. But the point is that if, let's say, you end up being worse because of the surgery, then you could file a lawsuit based on this tort, right? So what was happening though in Texas was that, and during the 1990s, during the Bush administration, and I do remember this because I do remember that when I was seeing ads for him, he talked about this. He talked about that he would run on tort reform. And basically, tort reform is to, because what was happening in Texas was there was a lot of these court cases. So many of these cases that doctors were even saying that they weren't going to practice medicine in Texas anymore because of this threat of lawsuits. That the doctors were making the argument that the lawyers were being, too they're being too lawsuit happy, so to speak, right? So ultimately, we have this tort reform that comes about in the 1990s, which favors interests of political physicians and insurance companies because they were the ones that were having to pay out all of this money when it came to these tort cases, right? So we do see also, of course, the creation of the Office of Patient Protection here. So we see that what ultimately happens with the tort reform of the 1990s in the state was they limited the amount of money that you could get in a tort, and they also made it harder to win a tort. So punitive damages, again, gross negligence versus malice. So they made it to where it was harder to prove that the doctor did this on purpose. That if it was an honest mistake, then it would be a lot harder for you. Not to say that it's still right to make a mistake, but my point is that it's going to be a lot harder for you to be able to get, to be able to win a tort case. You would have to prove that the doctor willingly, messed up or was like drunk or something like that. Not that they would, but I'm just giving you real honest examples. But you know what I mean? Like if they were totally not prepared, uh, instead of just making a mistake, because at least they were acting in good faith. Good faith is a good, popular term for that, right? Were they acting in good faith? Did they try their best and they just, it just wasn't executed properly? That's different than if, let's say, oh, the guy showed up drunk and he messed up my body, So you see how like there's a difference there. Um, so punitive damages were also limited because it made it harder for them to prove that the doctors actually engaged in malice activities. Joined several liabilities, so they were also limited to the 11% rule, where in terms of limiting the amount of money that they could be able to get in these tort reforms, because again, some of these payouts were getting in were becoming extremely expensive. Venue also that they also were going to be specific in terms of where the case could be tried. In terms of it needing to be where the actual where the actual surgery was happening, and then deceptive trade practice consumer proof. Um, so yeah, so what was happening here, like I said, is just that for tort, what I want you all to understand is that basically that the tort reform made it harder to be able to get these monetary and punitive damages from these medical surgeries that people, because also a lot of people were basically saying that, like, if, let's say, their body didn't heal from the surgery, which, because again, keep in mind that that's always a risk. And now I'm not a medical professional, so, but from what I have read and what I do know, that surgeries do carry a form of risk, right? The doctor can't say for sure 100% that it's going to work completely, right? Surgery is always a risk. So what was happening was that you had these people who the surgery didn't work, and so they were filing these torts because the surgery didn't go as expected. But again, that's not necessarily the doctor's fault, because again, it's always a risk. The human body, they try their best, but there are other factors, that we're still kind of learning about the human body and things like that. So, but okay, anyway, so let me go in here for today because I know it's already time. I know some of y'all probably want to go already. So let me go ahead and stop the recording here. So